They said Sebastian Laurent Devereaux was inevitable, born into legacy, raised among marble halls and oil portraits of men who had shaped continents. His name opened doors before he touched them. His presence recalibrated rooms. Investors leaned in when he spoke. Diplomats adjusted their tone. Headlines followed him like loyal subjects. Sebastian did not chase influence. He inherited it. And beside him, never loud, never seeking light, stood Nia Seraphina Okoye. She did not compete with the Devereaux name. She refined it. Where Sebastian commanded attention, Nia commanded understanding. Where he expanded territory, she secured loyalty. Where he sought elevation, she measured consequence. The kingdom praised his ambition, but it trusted her restraint. For years, their balance was seamless. Decisions appeared effortless. Alliances felt natural. The dynasty moved as one organism, polished, untouchable, unified. Until admiration became more intoxicating than wisdom. Until applause felt lighter than accountability. The first shift wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Meetings rescheduled without her counsel. Press features highlighting his independent vision. Strategists repositioning her as ornamental instead of foundational. He did not remove her from his life. He removed her from the structure. And kingdoms are rarely destabilized by scandal. They are undone by imbalance. Nia noticed everything. She said nothing. Because real power does not protest. Wait. And when she finally stepped back, the silence she left behind was louder than any accusation. Sebastian thought he was ascending. But the kingdom was already recalibrating. And soon, it would remember exactly who had been holding it together. Sebastian Laurent Devereaux had been prepared for power long before he understood what it cost. His childhood unfolded beneath vaulted ceilings and ancestral oil portraits. Men in tailored coats, women in silk and diamonds, all bearing the same composed expression that suggested permanence. The Devereaux name was not simply known. It was institutional. It carried investment portfolios across continents, philanthropic boards that shaped policy, and quiet political access that rarely needed to be announced. From an early age, Sebastian learned that posture mattered, that silence could intimidate, that a well-timed pause could close negotiations faster than persuasion. Tutors refined his diction. Advisors sharpened his instincts. By the time he inherited his father's seat at the head of the dynasty's global consortium, the transition felt less like a promotion and more like destiny fulfilled. The public adored him. Magazines praised his restraint. Financial networks described him as visionary. At international galas, cameras angled instinctively toward him as if light favored his presence. He moved through those rooms with an ease that suggested both breeding and calculation. Tall, impeccably tailored. His composure edged with just enough mystery to feel untouchable. To the outside world, Sebastian embodied evolution. The old money heir who modernized tradition. The aristocrat who embraced innovation. The man who could speak legacy in one sentence and expansion in the next. He wore prestige comfortably. And prestige in return wore him like proof. Boardrooms rarely questioned him. Investors aligned quickly. Diplomats responded with measured respect. When he entered a negotiation, outcomes seemed inevitable. It wasn't dominance alone that defined him. It was certainty. A belief, shared by those around him, that he belonged exactly where he stood. The Devereaux crest, embossed in gold above private entrances and etched discreetly onto foundation plaques, symbolized endurance, stability, permanence. Sebastian treated it not as burden, but inheritance. He believed stewardship meant growth, visibility, relevance. And he excelled at it. Under his leadership, the dynasty expanded into tech initiatives and cultural institutions. He appeared at global forums, speaking about innovation with calm conviction. Headlines framed him as the future of aristocratic power. Modern, disciplined, refined. He learned to enjoy the admiration. The way applause lingered a second longer than necessary. The way cameras waited for his expression before flashing. The way rooms leaned forward. He told himself it was responsibility. That visibility strengthened legacy. That influence required presence. But even inevitability has blind spots. And the higher Sebastian rose in public prestige, the more he began to mistake recognition for reinforcement, as though admiration itself were proof that the foundation beneath him did not need tending. The dynasty looked flawless, unshakable, crowned by history. What few understood was that kingdoms are not sustained by inheritance alone. They are sustained by balance. And balance, though invisible, does not disappear quietly when ignored. If Sebastian was inevitability, Nia Seraphina Okoye was equilibrium. She did not arrive in rooms the way he did. There was no inherited crest announcing her presence, no ancestral portraits framing her lineage in gilded certainty. Yet when she stepped beside him, poised, deliberate, luminous in quiet confidence, something in the atmosphere settled. Nia carried heritage differently. Daughter of diplomats and scholars raised between Lagos and Geneva, she understood power not as dominance, but as negotiation, as rhythm, as cultural fluency that moved beneath language. Her education had not only refined her intellect, it had sharpened her perception. She noticed hesitation before it surfaced, detected pride before it hardened, understood what alliances required beyond contracts. Sebastian commanded rooms. Nia calibrated them. At galas, while cameras angled toward her husband, Nia mapped the emotional temperature of the evening. She knew which investors required reassurance, which ministers valued discretion, which philanthropists sought acknowledgement more than partnership. Her conversations were never long, never theatrical, but precise. A hand resting lightly at an elbow, a measured compliment, a question posed softly enough to feel like curiosity, yet deliberate enough to redirect momentum. The dynasty's expansion appeared seamless because she anticipated friction before it formed. When negotiations grew tense, Sebastian often found clarity returning after a brief exchange of glances with her across the table. A subtle shift in her posture signaled caution. A steady nod encouraged conviction. He rarely questioned how often her instincts proved correct. At home, her influence was even less visible. Staff loyalty deepened under her guidance. International foundations maintained cohesion through her correspondence. Cultural initiatives gained authenticity because she insisted on integrity rather than optics. She protected the Devereaux name from quiet missteps no press release would ever reveal. Nia never claimed credit. She did not need to. Authority, she believed, was not proven through volume. It was sustained through alignment. Where Sebastian's ambition pushed outward, hers pressed inward, fortifying structure, reinforcing trust, preserving dignity across cultures that observed the dynasty closely. She understood that legacy was not only built through expansion, but through careful preservation of respect. People often described her as graceful. They meant composed. They meant elegant. What they did not see was the strategy beneath that composure. The calculations made in silence. The steady rebalancing that ensured Sebastian's rise did not outpace stability. She was not ornamental. She was infrastructural. And like all infrastructure, her presence felt ordinary only because it had never been absent. 4 years, the Devereaux dynasty moved with fluid confidence, admired publicly, trusted privately. Few questioned why deals closed smoothly or why reputations remained intact despite scrutiny. They assumed it was legacy. They assumed it was Sebastian. They did not realize the crown rested securely because Nia's hands were steady beneath it. And steady hands, when withdrawn, do not tremble. They simply let gravity speak. The shift began so subtly that even Sebastian mistook it for growth. At first, it was harmless. Invitations to speak at global summits where applause carried further than policy. Award ceremonies where his name was introduced with reverence polished by rehearsed admiration. Profiles that framed him not as steward of a legacy, but as its singular architect. He told himself it was evolution. The Devereaux dynasty needed visibility, modern relevance, A face that could stand alone beneath bright lights without leaning on ancestral shadows. And for the first time, Sebastian discovered something intoxicating. Applause that belonged entirely to him. In those rooms, sleek, contemporary, detached from marble halls and oil portraits, he was not measured against history. He was celebrated for presence. His words were quoted before they were fully digested. His pauses interpreted as brilliance. His ambition described as visionary rather than expected. There were no careful glances across the table, no silent recalibrations, no subtle restraint, only admiration. Felt lighter. At charity galas, younger executives leaned in eagerly. Influencers praised his independent leadership. Media strategists suggested positioning him as the future of aristocratic modernity. Streamlined, self-made in image if not in inheritance. Sebastian listened. He began speaking more without waiting, announcing initiatives before full consultation, trusting instinct where once he had sought reinforcement. The press responded warmly. Headlines multiplied. Social circles widened. He noticed how rooms changed when he entered alone. They opened differently. He told himself independence was strength, that standing at the center without visible support signaled authority. Nia still stood beside him at formal functions, composed and luminous, but increasingly the cameras angled tighter, cropping frames, isolating his silhouette against curated backdrops. Interviews focused on his individual vision. Advisors suggested simplifying messaging. Name. One face. One narrative. Sebastian did not consciously remove her. He simply stopped factoring her presence into his momentum. There were moments, brief, nearly imperceptible, when he sensed imbalance. A deal moving faster than comfort allowed. An endorsement secured without the usual depth of loyalty. But applause has a way of drowning hesitation. And admiration, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like confirmation. He began chasing it subtly. A longer standing ovation. A more exclusive invitation. A feature positioning him as global power without reference to partnership. He convinced himself the dynasty was evolving. That tradition needed singularity. That shared authority blurred clarity. The Devereaux name grew louder in public discourse, but quieter in private cohesion. Sebastian mistook the amplification for security. The brighter the spotlight, the less he felt the need to check the foundation beneath him. Applause, he discovered, was persuasive. Suggested permanence. It rewarded expansion. It never cautioned restraint. And as he leaned further into rooms that celebrated him without question, he failed to notice something essential. Admiration reflects, does not anchor. And reflection, however flattering, cannot hold the weight of a crown. The new circles did not resemble the old ones. They were brighter, faster, less restrained by lineage and more intoxicated by momentum. Private lounges overlooking city skylines replaced ancestral estates. Conversations drifted toward influence metrics, global rankings, cultural dominance. Legacy was acknowledged, but reinvention was worshipped. Sebastian moved easily among them. In these spaces, he was not the careful heir balancing centuries of expectation. He was the modern aristocrat who dared to redefine power. Entrepreneurs praised his decisiveness. Media executives admired his composure. Cultural tastemakers positioned him as the face of a new dynasty. Refined, visible, singular. They spoke to him directly. Not through counsels. Not through long-standing alliances. But to him. There was something disarming about the simplicity of it. You don't need to dilute your vision, one strategist told him over a private dinner in Paris. The world responds to clarity. A single figure. A single voice. Others echoed it. You're stronger when you stand alone. Legacy is powerful, but individuality is magnetic. People follow leaders, not partnerships. The language was polished, encouraging, designed to sound empowering rather than isolating. Sebastian listened. He began accepting invitations without consultation. Approved initiatives framed around his personal philosophy rather than shared governance. Public relations teams adjusted narratives subtly, positioning him as the nucleus of the Devereaux evolution. Profiles highlighted his intellect, his foresight, his leadership style. References to Nia grew softer, more ceremonial. At events, she was introduced with elegance but less emphasis. Her presence became aesthetic, dignified, admired, but peripheral to the momentum gathering around him. The new elite reinforced what applause had begun. That visibility was validation. That independence was strength. That collective leadership blurred authority. Sebastian felt sharpened in their company. Unburdened by deliberation. Unquestioned in ambition. When deals accelerated, they applauded decisiveness. When risks stretched beyond tradition, they praised boldness. No one cautioned restraint. No one redirected tone with a subtle glance across a conference table. The absence felt like efficiency. He began mistaking agreement for alignment. These polished circles thrived on elevation. They celebrated ascent, curated optics, magnified presence. Their loyalty was warm but conditional, rooted in momentum rather than history. Sebastian thrived in it. The language of exclusivity flattered him. The proximity to global tastemakers suggested inevitability beyond inheritance. He was no longer just heir to a dynasty. He was brand movement future. Meanwhile, the old alliances observed quietly. They attended gatherings, nodded politely, adjusted posture. But something had shifted beneath the surface, an imperceptible recalibration of trust. Prestige had grown louder, but stability had grown quieter. Sebastian did not yet recognize the difference. In polished circles, ego is not criticized. It is refined. And refinement, when mistaken for reinforcement, can slowly separate a leader from the very structure that once made him unshakable. The applause remained. The invitations multiplied. The lights grew brighter. But brightness has a way of obscuring the edges of what once held everything together. Nia did not discover the shift in a single moment. It revealed itself in patterns. A briefing she would normally receive arriving summarized instead of detailed. A diplomatic dinner scheduled through an assistant rather than discussed over evening tea. A foundation initiative announced publicly before she had seen its framework. Individually, each omission could be explained. Collectively, they formed design. She noticed first in conversation. Advisors who once sought her counsel now phrased updates as conclusions. Invitations that previously arrived addressed jointly now carried Sebastian's name alone. Hers appended as courtesy. Ceremonial, not strategic. She observed without interruption. At galas, introductions lingered on Sebastian's innovation while her role was described as supportive or inspirational. Words softened deliberately. Language reframed subtly. Influence recategorized as presence. Nia did not correct them. She listened. She felt it most in boardrooms. Where once her questions had redirected discussions before tension hardened, she now found herself uninformed until final votes. Decisions accelerated without her quiet calibration. Risk assessments bypassed her review. Not out of hostility, out of assumption. The dynasty was evolving, they believed. Streamlining visibility. Clarifying leadership. She understood something more precise. She was not being replaced in affection. She was being repositioned in structure. One evening, seated alone in her private study, she reviewed correspondence from the past 6 months. Patterns emerged with clinical clarity. Advisors shifting allegiance toward singular authority. Public narratives narrowing focus. Internal memos reframing her initiatives as independent of strategic direction. It was elegant, intentional. No confrontation. No spectacle. Just gradual reduction. She felt no surge of anger. No dramatic heartbreak. Only a cooling realization settling into her chest like truth long anticipated. Loyalty, when unacknowledged, becomes invisible. For years she had believed dignity required patience, that shared leadership did not demand constant assertion, that preserving harmony meant absorbing imbalance quietly. But harmony requires recognition. Without it, silence becomes erasure. She thought of every glance exchanged across negotiating tables, every caution delivered without spectacle, every alliance reinforced behind closed doors to protect Sebastian's ascent. Those efforts had not diminished. They had been reclassified. Optional. The realization did not wound her pride, clarified her position. She was not being excluded from rooms by mistake. She was being edited from narrative. Nia closed her laptop slowly. The room around her, lined with books spanning continents, artifacts reflecting both her heritage and the dynasty she had fortified, felt unfamiliar. Not because it had changed, because its center of gravity had. She understood now that applause had not only elevated Sebastian, it had simplified him. Simplification required singularity, and singularity required subtraction. She did not confront him that night. Confrontation would imply negotiation. Instead, she recalibrated. Not in anger, in precision. If her influence was no longer required structurally, she would withdraw it deliberately. Not to punish, not to provoke, but to observe what remained when balance was no longer quietly maintained. Power, she knew, rarely announces its departure. It simply stops holding what once depended on it. Nia did not announce her withdrawal. She did not resign from boards or decline invitations abruptly. She continued to appear where expected, poised, attentive, impeccably composed. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. But she stopped intervening. The difference was immediate, though subtle enough to escape notice at first. In negotiations, she no longer redirected tension with a carefully timed question. When projections carried unexamined risk, she allowed them to proceed unchallenged. When cultural nuances surfaced in international partnerships, she did not translate them gently into clarity. She let conversations complete themselves. Sebastian felt the shift as efficiency. Meetings ended faster. Decisions moved forward without deliberation, stretching late into the night. Advisors praised the streamlined pace. Public statements were released without layers of refinement. Momentum, they called it. Nia called it exposure. She withdrew from behind-the-scenes correspondence that once reinforced trust between foundations and governments. She stopped smoothing misunderstandings before they hardened into hesitation. She allowed minor misalignments to exist without immediate correction. Nothing catastrophic happened, first, but the rhythm of the dynasty changed. Responses from long-standing allies arrived hours later than usual. Language grew cautious. Agreements once sealed with mutual confidence now required formal assurances. Small uncertainties accumulated like fine cracks in marble, barely visible but structural. Sebastian compensated with presence. More appearances, more interviews, more declarations of vision. His confidence intensified, voice firmer, posture sharper. He interpreted the friction as resistance to modernization, a necessary discomfort before evolution settled. Applause still followed him, but it echoed differently. In private gatherings, investors began asking for clearer guarantees. Cultural leaders requested deeper consultation. Diplomats inquired subtly about internal shifts. Nothing accusatory, merely observant. Nia noticed how often eyes drifted toward her in those moments, not seeking her reaction but measuring her silence. She offered none. At home, the distance between them widened without argument. Conversations remained civil, measured, but hollowed of strategic partnership. Sebastian spoke of expansion. She listened without recalibration. He mistook her composure for agreement. He did not recognize it as absence. The staff felt it first. The steady reassurance that once flowed quietly through the estate no longer carried the same certainty. Advisors sensed it next. The invisible safety net beneath bold decisions had thinned. The kingdom did not collapse. leaned. And leaning kingdoms attract recalculation. Nia observed the shift without satisfaction or sorrow. She had not dismantled anything. She had only stopped holding what was no longer acknowledged. Balance, when withdrawn, does not create chaos. It reveals dependency. Sebastian believed visibility would restore cohesion. That authority could be amplified until it overwhelmed hesitation. But amplification cannot replace alignment. And as alliances cooled and conversations grew cautious, the dynasty began responding to a truth neither of them had yet spoken aloud. Prestige can command attention, but only balance commands trust. And trust, once unsettled, does not rush to return. The first fracture did not come with accusation. It arrived as hesitation. A partnership that had once renewed automatically requested extended review. A cultural initiative postponed its announcement pending further alignment. A diplomatic envoy, long accustomed to informal understanding, insisted on formal guarantees. Language shifted. Not hostile. Anxious. Sebastian felt it as inconvenience. Growing pains of expansion, he told himself. Evolution always unsettled those attached to tradition. He responded the way he had learned to respond to resistance, by tightening control. More oversight. More direct communication. Fewer intermediaries. He began leading negotiations personally, speaking with heightened certainty, emphasizing growth projections and global relevance. He positioned the Devereaux name as unstoppable. But something beneath the surface resisted. Allies listened politely, nodding in measured intervals. Yet their agreement lacked the quiet confidence that once defined their partnerships. They no longer leaned toward him instinctively. They evaluated. The difference was subtle, devastating. At international forums, applause still followed his speeches. Yet afterward, private conversations felt thinner. Questions probed deeper. Clarifications lingered longer than comfort allowed. Sebastian sensed it but misnamed it. Jealousy. Resistance. Fear of innovation. He did not yet call it imbalance. Within the consortium, advisors moved carefully. Recommendations grew conservative. Reports included disclaimers. Long-standing collaborators began diversifying alliances quietly, not abandoning the dynasty, but buffering against instability. The Devereaux crest still shone above entrances, but certainty no longer radiated from within. Nia observed the recalibration without commentary. Invitations now arrived addressed to her independently. Cultural leaders requested private meetings. Philanthropic boards sought her insight into long-term preservation rather than rapid expansion. They did not speak against Sebastian. They spoke toward stability. The shift was organic, instinctual. Trust, after all, follows equilibrium. At home, Sebastian's restlessness sharpened. Late-night calls extended past midnight. His tone edged with impatience. He questioned advisors more directly, demanded reaffirmations, requested projections recalculated. Control became emphasis. Confidence required repetition. He glanced at Nia occasionally during dinners, perhaps expecting reassurance, perhaps searching for critique. She offered neither, only attentive composure. Her stillness unsettled him more than opposition would have. He had grown accustomed to applause. He was unprepared for silence. Legacy, once fluid and expansive, now felt weighted. Not collapsing, tilting. The kind of shift visible only to those who understood architecture. A slight imbalance in foundation. A redistribution of trust. The dynasty remained powerful, but power without cohesion strains. And as weeks passed, the pattern clarified. Deals required persuasion instead of assurance. Partnerships required negotiation instead of understanding. Presence required effort instead of inevitability. Sebastian worked harder. The kingdom leaned further. Meanwhile, Nia's name circulated in conversations not as ornament, but as reference point. Advisors recalled her past counsel with renewed appreciation. International allies remembered her steadiness. Legacy was not dissolving. It was recalibrating. And in that recalibration, the kingdom began orienting itself not toward spectacle, but toward the axis it trusted most. Sebastian felt the tilt. He simply did not yet know how far it would go. The confrontation did not erupt. It arrived late one evening, carried in the quiet between them. Sebastian stood near the long windows of their private residence, city lights stretching beyond the glass like constellations that once felt obedient. His jacket lay discarded across a chair. His tie loosened. The composure he wore in public had thinned. "I don't understand what's happening," he said finally, voice controlled but strained beneath the surface. "Alliances are hesitating. Decisions are questioned. It's as if the ground has shifted." Nia remained seated, hands folded lightly in her lap. The lamplight softened her expression, but not her clarity. "The ground hasn't shifted," she replied gently. "It's responding." He turned toward her fully then, frustration sharpening his posture. Responding to what? To absence, she thought. To imbalance. To singularity mistaken for strength. But she did not rush her answer. For months, he had moved forward without consultation, without recalibration. For months, applause had drowned caution. And now, in the quiet aftermath, he searched for external causes. "You streamlined leadership," she said at last. "You simplified the narrative." "That was necessary," he countered. "Clarity inspires confidence." "For some," she agreed softly. The air between them grew denser, not hostile, heavy with unspoken recognition. He stepped closer. "You've been distant," he said, as if naming it might restore control. "You stopped engaging." Engaging. As though her years of calibration had been optional commentary. Nia met his gaze without accusation. There was no anger in her expression. No triumph. Only truth. "You wanted to shine alone," she said quietly. "So I stepped aside." The words did not rise. They settled. Sebastian felt them land in places applause had never reached. "I never asked you to step aside. You didn't have to." Silence followed. Not the kind that precedes argument. The kind that follows recognition. He replayed recent months in fragments. Meetings accelerated, counsel bypassed, narratives narrowed. Praise. The invitations. The polished voices assuring him that singularity strengthened legacy. He had not dismissed her. He had simply stopped depending on her. The distinction now felt devastating. "You think this is my fault?" he asked, though the question lacked conviction. "I think balance was removed," she replied. "And kingdoms lean when balance disappears." There was no accusation in her tone. No demand for apology. Only observation. For the first time, Sebastian understood that what he had lost was not support. It was alignment. He had mistaken visibility for legitimacy, admiration for trust, independence for authority. And in doing so, he had separated himself from the very force that steadied him. "I thought I was strengthening the dynasty," he said, quieter now. "You were strengthening your image." The difference settled between them like finality. Outside, the city lights continued to shimmer, indifferent to revelation. Inside, Sebastian stood confronted not by opposition, but by clarity. And clarity, he realized too late, does not negotiate. It simply reveals what has already shifted beyond recall. The shift did not require announcement. It unfolded quietly, the way seasons change, noticed first by those paying attention. In the weeks following that conversation, invitations began arriving addressed solely to Nia Seraphina Okoye. Cultural councils requested her presence at strategic forums. International foundations sought her counsel on long-term sustainability. Diplomats reached out privately, asking for perspective rather than endorsement. She did not campaign for relevance. She responded with steadiness. Where Sebastian's initiatives had accelerated outward, Nia's engagements moved deliberately inward, rebuilding trust, reinforcing partnerships, restoring confidence where hesitation had begun to root. She asked fewer questions than before, but the ones she posed carried weight. Conversations that once stalled found direction again under her measured tone. People leaned toward her instinctively, not because she demanded authority, 'cause she embodied it. Sebastian observed the realignment with a clarity that no applause could soften. In meetings where he once dominated, he now noticed how attention subtly gravitated toward Nia when complexity surfaced. Advisors sought her assessment before finalizing projections. Long-standing allies addressed her directly when discussing legacy preservation. The Devereaux name did not diminish, stabilized, but the axis had shifted. Nia did not reclaim space beside him in the way the public might expect. She did not resume silent calibration behind closed doors. Instead, she stepped into rooms on her own terms, establishing independent initiatives that reflected her heritage and philosophy. Cross-continental education programs, cultural preservation funds, strategic partnerships rooted in integrity rather than visibility. Influence followed her naturally, not amplified, anchored. The difference was unmistakable. Sebastian found himself invited to participate rather than preside, consulted rather than assumed. The realization was not humiliating, it was humbling. He had believed the crown rested upon inheritance and visibility. Now he saw it rested upon trust. And trust had chosen its center. There were no public scandals. No dramatic separations. The dynasty did not fracture. It recalibrated. Advisors adjusted structure to reflect dual authority where once singular emphasis had been pushed. Public narratives expanded again, acknowledging the depth of Nia's strategic leadership. The kingdom remembered. Not with noise. With recognition. In quiet corridors of influence, her name carried assurance. Investors referenced her prudence. Cultural leaders cited her vision. Stability returned not because she demanded it, but because she restored equilibrium without spectacle. One evening, standing alone on a balcony overlooking the city, Nia felt no triumph, only peace. The skyline shimmered as it always had, indifferent to individual ascent. Yet the air felt lighter. She had not fought for the crown. She had stepped into her own sovereignty. Sebastian joined her after a moment, not to reclaim position, but to stand in awareness. He understood now that legitimacy is not inherited through title alone. It is sustained by those who protect it from imbalance. The Devereaux dynasty endured. But its future no longer revolved around singular brilliance. It revolved around remembered strength. And as conversations across continents carried her name with quiet confidence, it became clear to anyone who understood power. The kingdom had not chosen louder leadership. It had chosen steadier hands.